The House Appropriations Subcommittee on Transportation will come to order. Clerk, please call the roll.
Representative Puri.
Here.
Representative Morgan.
Here.
Representative Hood. Representative Steklov.
Present.
Representative Skaggs. Representative Steele.
Here.
Representative Borton.
Here.
Sir, you have 5 of 7 members. You have a quorum.
Very good, thank you. Representative Steklov moves to approve minutes from the Transportation Subcommittee meeting last week on February 14th. Without objection, the minutes are approved. All right. Very good. All right. Well, welcome back, everyone. The subcommittee has a pretty straightforward meeting ahead of us today. We're going to be hearing from our very own Bill Hamilton, our House Fiscal Analyst. Mr. Hamilton will start off by giving an overview of the governor's proposed FY 24-25 state transportation budget. After this, he will give a brief overview of transportation funding in Michigan and its history. In the coming weeks, here in the subcommittee, we're going to hear testimony from a number of various groups on transportation and infrastructure and revenue. Having a deeper understanding of the history of transportation funding in Michigan will hopefully provide the necessary background for a number of our members. And so with that, Mr. Hamilton, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm going to impinge on your space a little. So the members, and I'll mark Rep. Hood in the attendance while I'm at it. So the members have manila folders in front of you. Staff should also. We have a number of documents. The first one we're going to walk through is a standard House Fiscal Agency summary document that looks like this. It should be in the top of your pile. And this is an overview, a summary document that shows the governor's proposed budget for the fiscal year ending September 30th, 2025 in comparison with the current year budget. So we could call this a document of change. Almost all the items are discussed as a change from the current year. And as is true about all these documents, it begins with a table up at the top. And the first column of the table represents the enacted current year budget. And you can see the gross appropriation at the bottom of that left column, $6,626,549,900, and henceforth we'll round up, or not round up, but simply round. We'll describe this as a $6.6 billion budget. It includes $288.1 million of state general fund. In most budgets, the fiscal analysis documents focus on the general fund appropriation. General fund is the fund source that appropriators have most discretion over. But as you can see in this budget, most of the funding supporting this budget comes from state restricted funds, a bit under $4.1 billion in the current year. And the second big supporting fund source comes from federal revenue. That's a bit, it's $2.1 billion, a bit over $2.1 billion. The next column represents the executive budget recommendation for 2025. And the gross appropriation in 2025 would be $6,781 million. And again, that's supported primarily from state restricted funds and federal funds. And then the next column, again, is the column of change. The change in gross appropriation would be $154.7 million. That's a 2.3% increase. And most of the change you see occurring in the general fund appropriation. And in this budget, all of the general fund is found in the one-time section. General fund does not support ongoing or baseline department programs. So all of the general fund is in one time, and that's the big change in this budget, $103.1 million decrease from the current year. And again, some of the other items reflect changes in revenue estimates, estimated federal revenue, and estimated state restricted revenue. One other quick note before I get into the detail, when we talk about state restricted funds, in this budget, the biggest source of state restricted funds is the Michigan Transportation Fund. You'll hear it talk about the MTF, and the MTF receives revenue primarily from motor fuel taxes and vehicle registration taxes. Those are constitutionally restricted for transportation. The MTF also receives a $600 million earmark of income tax revenue that was part of the November 2015 road funding package. And the last few years has also received an earmark of the excise tax on recreational marijuana. which is about $100 million now in that range. And one quick note about federal revenue before I get into the detail. Federal revenue is authorized through a federal authorizing legislation. We call it, well, shoot, what's the formal name? It's the Federal Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, and we shorthand that as IJA. So you'll hear us talking about IJA is the umbrella federal authorizing legislation that authorizes surface transportation programs, and in the current iteration, some other transportation funding programs. So that's all by way of background, looking at the table, some explanation. The next section, we will run through the changes in particular programs and line items, and I'll try to run through those fairly quickly, but at the same time giving you some background in the program. The first item is debt service. The appropriation in the current year, $373.7 million, and the budget reflects a decrease of $3 million. That's a bit counterintuitive because we know the department is selling bonds, has been selling bonds since 2020, and the reason there's a decrease, most years the appropriation for debt service simply reflects known debt service schedules. The department knows what they have to pay in the next fiscal year, so they can budget that to the $100, to the dollar really. In 2024 and 2025, they had to estimate debt service on bonds they had not yet issued. So 2024 is a little high, so we see the adjustment in 2025, a decrease of $3 million. In your package, I've got a much more detailed description of the bond program and debt service, which we could look at later, but anyway. Debt service, the next item, Transportation Asset Management Council. That's a independent council that collects data on the state pavement condition, both in the trunk line system and local road systems. And the budget includes $423,600 increase to provide additional support for data collection and information technology. The third item is a department operating line item, finance contracts and support services, and the budget reflects a $270,000 increase for what's called My Cars. It's a cash receipt and accounts receivables system. And there's also an adjustment in the interdepartmental grant, so that's a net increase of $156,200. Item 4, planning services. So again, we talked about IJA. The state of Michigan, federal funds are made available to the state of Michigan for eligible federal projects and programs. And to get access to that funding, the Michigan Department of Transportation has to comply with a number of federal requirements, including planning requirements. And so you see in the current year, $24 million of federal funds in that program, in that line item, and the budget reflects a $2 million increase in federal aid through IJA to support statewide planning and research. Next page, item 5, state trunk line maintenance. So this line item represents ongoing routine reactive maintenance on the state trunk line system, snow plowing, pavement patching, grass cutting, traffic signals. And in the current year, $466.1 million from the state trunk line fund, and the proposed budget would reflect an increase of $17.9 million from the state trunk line fund. The department has identified $12.8 million related to the increased cost of maintenance material, and they also identified $5.1 million for state trunk line maintenance contracts they have with county road commissions. Item 6 is the big line item that represents the state trunk line road and bridge construction program, the capital program, the orange barrel program of state trunk line construction and reconstruction. Again, you see it's almost $1.5 billion in the current year, and in 2025, the budget proposal would increase by $123.4 million gross. $76.5 million represents increased available federal aid anticipated by the department, and almost $46.9 million is an adjustment of state restricted revenue, primarily from the state trunk line fund, available for this program. Item 7, Michigan Transportation Fund, MTF. So the Michigan Transportation Fund, a large portion of that is distributed to local road agencies, county road commissions in cities and villages. The current fiscal year appropriation is $1.9 billion. The budget would reflect an increase of MTF revenue of almost $101 million from the MTF. And this is the appropriation. The actual distribution will be based on actual MTF revenue collected and distributed according to the provisions of Act 51. Item 8, there's a targeted program for local bridges. $5 million is earmarked in Act 51 for this local bridge program. In addition, there's an additional earmark of 1/2 cent of the revenue generated from 1/2 cent of the motor fuel tax and gasoline. So even though the motor fuel tax and gasoline has increased to 30 cents effective January 1st, the yield per penny has fallen because consumption has fallen. So that line item reflects a decrease in estimated revenue for this program of $483,800. Item 9 is another targeted program for the Movable Bridge Fund. And in this case, the appropriation is indexed to inflation. When first established, it was $5 million, and in the current year, a little over $6 million, and the budget reflects an increase of $150,500. There are 12 movable bridges in the state trunk line system, 12 on the local system owned by 8 separate jurisdictions. And that reflects the fact that these bridges have unique operating needs and operating costs. Item 10, this is a line item that reflects the fact that local road agencies have access to federal aid. We talked about IJA and the federal aid program. In Michigan, part of the federal aid highway funds are sub-allocated, although we're not supposed to use the word sub-allocated, but effectively they're sub-allocated to local road agencies. And that line item is almost $185 million in the current year. The budget reflects an increase of $26.2 million. And again, this reflects additional federal aid anticipated through this federal aid program, IJA. Item 11, this is another MDOT operating line for the Blue Water Bridge. The governor's budget recommends an increase in 3 authorized FTE positions and an increase of $515,800. This is entirely funded from the Blue Water Bridge Fund, which receives its revenue from Blue Water Bridge tolls. And again, this is the operating line for the Blue Water Bridge. Just as an aside, the structure of the bridge connects Port Huron to Sarnia, Ontario. MDOT, the state of Michigan, owns half the bridge up to the international border, and Ontario, Canada owns the other half. The line item only funds our half. Item 12, Transportation Economic Development Fund. Again, this is a targeted program. It receives funds in part from an earmark of the Michigan Transportation Fund and in part from an earmark of driver's license fees. The appropriation for the total program in the current year, almost $55.4 million, and the budget would show a reduction of $2.6 million, and that simply reflects anticipated available revenue in this program. Flipping to page 3. So at the top of page 3, we're now talking about public transportation programs. And the baseline programs supporting local bus operating assistance. In the current year, it's $216.7 million. That provides operating assistance to 80 public transit agencies in the state of Michigan. And the governor's budget proposes a $5 million increase. Below that, we show how in the current year, there's also a one-time appropriation from federal COVID relief funds, $45 million, and that is not carried forward into 2025 because it's not available. And so just one other point of reference, in 2024 reflected a $15 million increase from 2023. The governor's budget would propose another $5 million on top of that. So over 2 years, it's a $20 million increase in the baseline. Item 14 recognizes non-urban operating capital that recognizes a federal aid program to non-urban transit agencies. That's $39.8 million gross in the current year, and the budget would reflect an anticipated additional federal aid in that program. Transit capital also reflects a federal aid program to local transit agencies, capital grants to those agencies. The gross appropriation in the current year, $222.7 million, and the governor's proposed budget reflects a gross increase of $36.9 million. $22.4 million reflects anticipated additional federal aid, and almost $14.5 million in additional comprehensive transportation fund support, and that in part provides matching funds for the federal grants to local transit agencies. Service Initiatives is a targeted public transportation program. The gross appropriation in the current year, $18.7 million. The governor's budget reflects several revenue changes that net to an increase of $2.1 million. Specialized Services, again, another a targeted public transportation program targeted primarily for elderly disabled populations. The current fiscal year appropriation is $30.3 million gross, and that reflects an increase of $262.5 million. Then the next item, 18A and 18B, rail operations and infrastructure that provides in part support for the Amtrak rail passenger service in Michigan and some rail freight economic development programs. So the current year appropriation gross $137.7 million, and the budget would reflect an increase of $14.5 million from the Comprehensive Transportation Fund. However, in the current year, there's also a one-time appropriation from the Comprehensive Transportation Fund of $14.9 million. So the increase and decrease to some extent offset each other. Marine passenger service, this is a line item that provides capital assistance for a couple of ferry services in Michigan to Beaver Island and south of Sault Ste. Marie. And the federal program provides capital assistance. The budget reflects a $15.1 million increase in anticipated federal aid for that program. Item 20 reflects what's the Airport Improvement Program. That's a federal program of capital assistance to publicly owned airports. And it's almost $180 million in the current year. The budget would reflect an additional $3.6 million from the State Aeronautics Fund. And part of that increase is based on a proposed increase in the airport registration tax. Aircraft is registered in the same way automobiles, but it's a different formula, and the governor proposal includes an increase in that tax. And item 21 at the top, there's funding for the Detroit-Wayne County Airport from the Qualified Airport Fund, almost $6.4 million in the current year. The budget reflects an increase in estimated revenue of $390,000. Item 22, IJ Airport infrastructure grants. So this is an additional federal aid capital assistance program that's in addition to the Airport Improvement Program. It was established in IJA, $95 million in the current year, and the budget reflects anticipated federal aid increase of $20 million. Item 23, the budget would not retain a number of one-time items in the current year budget. However, there are three one-time items that are new included in the budget. Item 24, MI contracting opportunity, that is actually included in the current year at $3 million. The governor would propose an increase of $2 million to $5 million total, plus would like an authorization of one FTE position for that program. We talked about the Blue Water Bridge Fund. The governor's proposal requests $990,000 for a capital projects, one-time equipment and facilities. Item 26, the governor is requesting $150 million of general fund. $95 million of that is estimated to match all available federal aid highway funds. So the state of Michigan has access to federal aid highway funds, but they typically require a non-federal match, and there is concern that there is not enough state restricted funds to match all available federal funds in 2025. And it also includes, it's anticipated that what's not needed to match federal aid would be used for local bridge programs. Then finally, I think this is finally, item 27 at the bottom, the governor requests $30 million of general fund for transit innovation grants, and that would be a one-time appropriation. And then actually page 5, this is not in this budget. In the Department of Technology Management and Budget, there's a request for $6.6 million for MDOT information technology projects. And now finally, 29, in all the MDOT operating lines, there's an adjustment for what we describe as economics. That's the additional cost of employee salaries, workers' compensation, retirement contributions. And across all the MDOT operating lines, that totals $10.9 million, almost entirely with state restricted funds. And as you can see, I'm not going to run through this. There are a whole number of boilerplate changes. Again, typically the executive budget deletes a whole number of legislative mandated reporting requirements and directives. So those are all listed on the last 2 pages. And again, I'm not going to run through those, but they're available. So that's the overview of the budget.
Well, Bill, thank you very much. I was hoping you were going to run through the boilerplate line by line.
Well, I could.
But we'll opt not to today. But no, as always, thank you so much for your wealth of knowledge. I don't think there's anyone in Lansing that understands this budget as well as you do. And so thank you for that thorough breakdown of how we're spending a lot of money as a state. And so with that, I do want to open it up to questions amongst our colleagues. Are there any questions that we have? Rep. Steele?
Without fail. Just 2 quick questions. I'm not sure when the federal money is allocated and when they say, okay, this is how much Michigan gets, but let's just say, because there's a lot of federal assumptions on this budget, what if they're not available, and how will we know, and when will we know? And the other one is the airport registration tax. Does that have to be voted on? And if in the event that that's not voted on, what are we going to do to backfill? Basically that one, and how would we backfill the rest of them if the projections are incorrect?
Well, with respect to the federal aid transportation program, so the surface transportation programs are typically reauthorized for a 5-year period. And we talked about IJA. IJA includes the reauthorization of the surface transportation program. And you may be familiar with some of the other terminology from the previous program. There was the FAST Act, Safety Lou, T21. Depends on how long you've been in local government, you maybe not, or MDOT. So when those are reauthorized, the bill in the Federal Highway Administration, Federal Transit Administration will publish the effectively targets for the next 5 years. So the states will have a pretty good understanding of what's available. And then each year, for the highway program, the FHWA notifies the state of effectively the amount they can spend from those apportionments. So there are sometimes mid-year adjustments. Recently, in August, there was a significant additional funds made available to states. They call it the August redistribution. So sometimes those are adjusted, but effectively, states know within a range what is available. So that's number one. And yes, the aircraft registration tax is a tax established in statute. To change the tax, increase it in this case, will require an amendment to that statute. and obviously it has to be voted on by both chambers and signed by the governor. If that is not enacted, there'll be less state aeronautics fund revenue available for that program. So I think the estimate of the increase, I'm looking at the MDOT, is it 2 million, 2.5 million from the, maybe it's, or 5 million. So the anticipated increase from that tax would be 2.5 million on the authority of our friends in the second row.
All right. Thank you. Rep. Morgan.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Bill. This is always very interesting to hear you talk through. As I'm looking through this, I have just two quick questions. One, it looks like we're doing everything we can to pull down as many federal funds as possible. Is that correct? So that 150 million, that is ensuring that we're pulling down all available federal funds?
Yes, I believe historically, and our friends from MDOT I believe will confirm that, I don't believe that Michigan has ever, as you say, left federal funds on the table. And Patrick McCarthy, the budget officer or finance director, is acknowledging that. So federal funds are made available to the state. To draw those down for eligible programs and projects typically requires a non-federal match, and the state of Michigan has always provided enough non-federal funds to match all available federal funds.
Okay, great. The other question I have is, looking at the State Trunkline Road and Bridge Capital Program and several of the other programs for essentially our highway system, one of the issues that has come up near my district recently is a question of how MDOT funds those roads and looks at ways to reduce the vehicles on our highways. So as we look at a road and we say, okay, the traffic volume says we need to expand this road or look at some other option, a question has come up from folks saying, well, what if we invest in ways to alleviate congestion on those roads instead through buses or rail or something else, and then we don't need to expand a highway? The question I have, because I think the answer is, we don't have anything in this budget that would allow MDOT to invest in an alternative to reduce the need to review a highway expansion or other change. Is that correct?
Not specifically targeted. However, the line items are quite broad. Like the road and bridge program is a big umbrella line item. The planning services is a big, broad umbrella line item. So within those line items, MDOT, and they do planning, statewide planning. So obviously, members can work with the department. That's basically an MDOT question, how to get them to, if you wish, to change priorities in developing projects. So
Well-
it's not, there's nothing targeted in the budget, but it's possible in the current budget.
Okay, well, and I ask it as more of a policy and budget question, because as far as I have seen it, it doesn't look like we have any option for MDOT to say, okay, we have a lot of congestion on this highway. How do we reduce that congestion? There doesn't seem to be any particular funding mechanism to do that.
I believe it's available in the current funding. From the current resources, they can look at alternatives. And in fact, they do, especially in large projects, they do environmental impact analysis to see, they look at alternatives, preferred alternatives. So I think to some extent they do that.
Okay,
But
thank you.
again, that's really a question better directed at the department.
Sounds great. Thanks. Thank you, Chair.
Yep. Thank you. Rep. Hood.
Yeah, thank you for the presentation. Are you able to hear me well enough? So you've stated that the state of Michigan is investing enough funds to pull down federal dollars for the Department of Transportation, all of the available federal funds for MDOT. Can the same be said in terms of investing enough funding so that counties and municipal road entities can do the same? Are there increased financial pressures or strain because of IJA funds available and locals trying to pull down those matches for federal funds?
Again, I think that might be a question better addressed by MDOT. I will say that I don't know that much about what's happening at the local level with respect to matching available federal funds. I'm assuming that the locals have the same challenges as MDOT because the federal aid program has expanded so much under IJA, maybe roughly a 20% increase. So that's part of the reason MDOT has to think about how it's going to match available federal aid on its program, on its trunk line program. So I'm assuming that local agencies are making the same calculation, looking at available federal aid. And again, I think that varies. We talk about the local road system as if it were kind of one entity, but there are 83 road commissions, 531 cities and villages with different situations.
Mm-hmm. May I have another question? Are there places in this budget where we have made clear investments in pedestrian and bicycle safety? We know that we have a significant increase in pedestrian and bicycle injuries and fatalities on the road. How are we addressing that?
Not through any targeted line items specifically in the budget. Although there are opportunities within some of these larger, as we say, umbrella line items that encompass a whole number of activities. So again, that's something the department could testify about how they address non-motorized activities, pedestrian safety, things like that. So that's more of a department internal operating. So in short, there's nothing specific in the budget, but there is funding in the budget that would allow those kind of activities.
Thank you.
Sure. I'm just going to go to Rep. Skaggs first. Go ahead, Rep. Skaggs.
Thank you, Chair, and thanks, Bill, for your presentation. Just want to talk about airports and item 22. So this is obviously federal funding from IJA. I just am curious if you know, or if we can find out, what are the strings attached? What's the formula? What's the process? What's the way to have these grants put out in such a way that takes into context the different regions of the state?
Frankly, I know very little about that. Again, IJA is a fairly new program, a federal aid program. In this, these airport infrastructure grants are it's an entirely new program within IJA. And so in short, I'll find out.
Okay.
I'll get some more information.
That sounds good. Great, thanks.
Great, thank you. Rep. Borton.
Thank you, Chair. And thank you, Bill, for your presentation. Insightful as always. My question is, do you know how much money has come in from marijuana revenue to MDOT?
I do. Wait, let me shuffle through my papers for a moment.
I think it's 84 million,
Is that?
according to this chart.
Your form said
Oh, yeah, okay, look at that.
83.6.
Well, thank you. That was kind of a test to see if you were looking at my documents. So in the budget, in the current year budget assumes 83.6 million, but at the last consensus revenue estimating conference, and we got updated transportation revenue, it's over 100 million. It's a bit over 100 million. Not to editorialize, but it seems a bit surprising, but apparently it's, so I forget what the earmark is. It's an earmark of a portion of the total tax. I don't know what the total is.
35% of the total tax.
Okay.
It runs through the Michigan Transportation Fund.
So Troy's not on microphone, but the MTF share is 35% of the total excise tax and recreational marijuana. So divide 100 million by 35, is that how you do it? So it's 35% of the total, and in the last estimate, it's a bit over 100 million.
Okay, great. Thanks, Bill. Thank you, Chair.
Yep, you got it. All right. Well, thank you for that presentation. Thank you, everyone, for your questions. That was supposed to be the short version of today's testimony. So we are coming up on time a little bit. I think we'll give it a go. And so,
Well, I'll just highlight a couple.
Sure.
Well, first, since I'm walking and talking, so in the members packet and in the, we've got a couple of updated publications. So if you go to the House Fiscal Agency website, we've got several documents. One is, we just updated the publication on the Michigan Transportation Fund. We talked about the MTF. And so one thing to remember about the MTF, again, it's roughly $3.7 billion, and that follows a distribution model. So if you look at the document in the packet, it'll be on the agency website. It shows, there's a chart that shows that distribution. We also just updated the publication on MDOT bonding and debt service. That's in your packet, and the audience can find it on the HFA website. And then this is recently updated, and I'm gonna give you the 10-minute version of a 40-minute presentation. But I'm not just gonna talk fast, I'll just hit on the highlights. So again, this is on the, so here's the table of the current year budget. This corresponds to the budget analysis document. The current year, $6.6 billion, funded primarily from state restricted revenue, federal revenue, and some general fund. And well, I guess this is graphics. And you can see it better. It's better represented in a pie chart. So you can see 62% state restricted. Again, most of that flows through the MTF, federal funds, general fund. And the transportation budget, it's about 8% of the total budget, and it's a much smaller part of the state general fund budget. So here's a bar chart going back to 2005, just showing appropriations. Again, this is not actual, the appropriation. The blue lines are state restricted, the blue line, the green line, federal. And you can see a bump in 2009. There was additional federal aid made available through the federal stimulus programs during the Great Recession, what's come to be called the Great Recession. And this is the same information shown as a area chart. I think the big bump in 2009 shows up more. And if you look on the far right, the increases represent additional state restricted funds from the November 2015 road funding package, and in the last couple of years, additional federal aid through IJA. And then a very little tiny part in the top, that orange part, are these additional funds from the earmark of income tax revenue and marijuana excise tax revenue. Skipping. So here's a quick, like a big highlighted version of the programs supported in the budget. About 83% from for road and bridge programs, broadly understood. That includes distributions or funds made available to local units of government, county road commissions, cities and villages, also the state trunk line program, about 12% for public transportation programs, and a bit for aeronautics programs. Again, the aeronautics programs are almost exclusively capital assistance to local airports. And I'm going to skipping. So we talked about state restricted funds. Again, this is the current year. Of the $4.1 billion in state restricted funds that you see in the current year budget, 3.7 is, I'm sorry, oh, wait, this is the breakdown of total state restricted from the motor fuel tax on gasoline, the vehicle registration taxes, motor fuel tax on diesel, and the earmark of income tax and marijuana excise tax. Again, it's easy to visualize this as a pie chart. Skipping through all the texts. So one quick thing about, so we distribute the road and bridge funding between the state trunk line programs and local road agency programs. This is a representation of the two different systems. So with respect to route mileage or lane mileage, State trunk lines represent a bit over 9,600 lane miles. That's 8% of the total system. But then if you look across vehicle miles traveled, which is one measure of usage, state trunk lines represent almost 52% of vehicle miles traveled on the total state system. You see the same representation of bridges, bit over 4,500 bridge structures in the state trunk line system. That's only 40% of bridge structures, but they represent about 73.5% of deck area and 83.8% of average daily traffic. Again, that's another measure of usage. And you can visualize this. One great example, the I-75 bridge over the Rouge River in southwest Detroit. It's 8 lanes. The bridge is over a mile long, over 100,000 cars on that one facility every day. Public train. So wait, I got to find. I don't have much time. So you look at all of the appropriations in this budget, and you summarize them between state programs and local programs. So not everybody could. If you went to the budget, you wouldn't necessarily be able to duplicate this. This is my calculation of all of the different programs either distributed or made available. And in this case, 55% would be designated for local programs. That includes road agencies, public transportation agencies, and local public airports. And state programs almost exclusively highway programs, the state trunk line program, almost $3 billion in state programs. So I'm going to very quickly. So far we've just been talking about the budget. So let's talk about actual. And we're not going to talk so much about federal aid because there's a paper on the HFA website talking about federal aid that'll give you everything you need to know. And we're not going to talk about the general fund. Although I will say, one thing I'll say about the general fund is prior to 2012, general fund was almost never appropriated in the transportation budget. In 2012, we began to appropriate general fund revenue, and over the last 10 years, from 2012 through 2024, I guess it's 12 years, general fund appropriations have totaled $2.4 billion in this budget. And the same thing has happened at the federal level. So we talk about this as a user fee budget, or the transportation funding is a user fee model. Well, it hasn't really been a user fee model in that sense. We've been continuing to appropriate either directly $2.4 billion over 10, 12 years, plus the $600 million of income tax earmark. So it's really been quite disconnected from the user fee model for some time now. But look back to the Michigan Transportation Fund. It's the main collection and distribution fund for constitutionally restricted revenue, fuel taxes and registration taxes. And so this is the key chart. My whole presentation leads to this. So, okay, now you're paying attention. So if you look back, I used 1997 as the baseline. That was the last year the legislature affirmatively passed increases in baseline transportation taxes before November 2015. So I used 1997 as the baseline. It's also the year before I came to the Fiscal Agency, so it's all about my perspective. And we have great Excel spreadsheets going back that far, so it's very practical. So you can see in 1999-2000, MTF revenue, $1,893 million. And you put a trend line on that and looked at 2013, MTF revenue, $1,894 million. So for that entire period, MTF revenue is totally flat. And Rep. Skaggs asked last meeting about inflation adjustment. I included an inflation adjustment information in your packet. So even though since the implementation of the November 2015 road funding package, MTF revenue has increased to $3,733 million. That's a significant increase over a short period, but you also have to look at the context over the previous 15, 20-year period of flat MTF revenue. So again, that's a key to understanding one of the challenges in Michigan transportation funding. And this is a breakdown of the different sources. So one thing to note about this, the whole focus is often on the motor fuel tax on gasoline, or the gas tax. People talk about the gas tax. Well, for a number of years, vehicle registration taxes are actually the biggest contributor to the Michigan Transportation Fund. It's the little dotted blue line on the top. And again, you can see those taxes are fairly flat until 2017 with the implementation of the 2015 road funding package. The little orange line on the far right is the earmark of the income tax, which is now $600 million, plus the recreational marijuana tax. And the bar chart. So this I include, I'm going to wind up now. This is my last chart. So this is MDOT data. I include this in the House Fiscal Agency document, but it's from MDOT information. So you've all seen this. This is the pavement decay representation. And so back in 1997, they set a goal. The shorthand description of the goal is that the state trunk line pavement be in 90% good condition by, I believe, 2007. They hit that goal. You can see that the blue line hit the green line, carried forward, and began to decline. And it's now below that. And then the next chart shows MDOT's estimate. So this might be a couple years old. They update this regularly. This is, the orange line is pavement condition falling with current revenue projections. And again, if MDOT has fresher information, we can update this chart. And I believe, and I'll also allow them to testify about the funding gap. I think I've got a figure in the presentation, but we can let them update it. And my final note about this, so when you think about this, this is a representation of just one element of one part of our transportation system. This is simply a representation of pavement on the state trunk line system. It doesn't recognize the additional challenges of safety or mobility or connectivity, of public transportation, all of the other needs related to an integrated transportation system. This is simply a representation of that one element of the trunk line system. So that was 40 minutes. How am I? I'm okay.
Great job, Bill. I appreciate the lightning round there. And I appreciate you just kind of glossing over the words and going to the pretty pictures. That's how I read to my kids as well. I think that's the way to do it. So I think for a lot of the members, hopefully this jogs your memory from last year. I know there's a similar presentation information. So appreciate you bringing that information. You did go a little slower last year. But due to time, I'm going to ask members to just ask questions offline directly to Bill. Everyone knows where to find him. We do plan to meet again next week. We're going to start testimony from stakeholders just in the transportation infrastructure funding space, and then also begin discussions on new potential revenue sources for our budget, as that's going to be a big topic for us. And with that, Representative Hood moves to excuse absent members without any objection. With no further business, the committee will stand adjourned.